aircraft from the factory to Allied bases, and these were done by women because it was World War II, and very much a massive war effort. Men were expected to serve as male pilots are expected to serve as military pilots, so they needed women to fill the role. So sort of like Rosie the Riveter, you have Annie the Aviator. So both these programs, as I said, were similar, yet experienced very different careers. For example, the WASPs fought to become militarized after the war, but ultimately failed, whereas the ATAs recognized that they were civilians. This was a civilian Air Corps, and once the war ended, they were going to return to their civilian lives. So why is Bridget interested in this? There hasn't been a scholarly comparison between the two, even though they're very similar in their mission, but have very different careers, especially in the reaction to their deactivation. So for sources on the WASPs and the ATAs, being classified as memoirs and then secondary sources. Memoirs are obviously those written by members of the WASPs or ATAs about their experiences, and aren't really necessarily the most historically analytical, but very important for narrative, anecdotes, reactions, and that sort. And then there's secondary sources, which, as we all know, history books, narratives written by other people, analyses. So for WASP history, it's usually a narrative or an analysis of the deactivation. What happened there? Why were they deactivated? Why did they fought against it? Why they wanted to be militarized? Whereas for the ATAs, there's very little scholarship on the women themselves. It's usually incorporated into a greater narrative of the British war effort. So I'll briefly go over some of the works that Bridget has looked at. The first one is called Heroes Without Legacy, which is a history of American airwomen from 1912 to the end of World War II. So it includes a mini history of women, of Americans in the ATA, as well as the creation of WASPs. And the main point of this book is to question why women don't have the same legacy as men when it comes to aviation, because there are a number of important women in the very early history of aviation. And it focuses mainly on the publicity and media attention of these women, because they're seen as like glamorous, fantastic, something very unusual. The second source is entitled Clipped Wings, which takes a feminist point of view on the WASPs, and it looks at congressional records, military documents, interviews, and it attempts to explain the inequality that women experience in WASPs. Why weren't they received lower pay? Why weren't they treated the same as men? And explain deactivation in that sort of light. The final point was that there was a gender war going on. Women were attempting to take on a traditionally male role, and society reacted against it. Next is Golden Wings, which shows how the ATAs viewed their position differently than the WASP, except it's not really a comparison work. It is essentially saying ATAs understood their position as a civilian Air Corps, and again, they're going to be civilians, but they were still treated as equals, or they saw themselves as equals to their male counterparts, but they're also tired of being treated as these glamorous women. Wow, they're flying airplanes, as opposed to being treated the same way because of what they were doing, as opposed to who they were as women. And then the final one is Women Pilots of World War II, which is similar to Golden Wings, except that more focuses on the WASPs, and it's very much a chronological work. This happened, this happened, this happened. Not a whole lot to offer in terms of analysis. So the historiography of the WASP program and the ATAs is more on the experience of deactivation, their roles, the disparity between men and women. But there isn't a whole lot in terms of comparing these two remarkably similar yet also remarkably different programs. So Bridget's thesis is going to focus on the connections between the WASPs and the ATAs, show where they differed, why they were similar, and also question why the scholarship hasn't discussed really these differences up until this point. It's a very, aviation is very much a recent field, and women in aviation is, again, a very recent field. So it leaves her with a lot of room to work with, but also adds the additional challenge of there not being a lot to work with. So with that, I'll let you respond.
That was a pretty good overview. I just have one thing to add that I'm really, really interested in looking at. There's 2 archives in California of two American women that served with the ATA in Britain. So I'm really interested in looking at that as a connecting point between the 2 groups. And yeah, not concerned with militarization, because everybody seems to be concerned with that, especially since the ATA didn't experience that. And I'm really focused on when these 2 programs were alive, and not when the male combat pilots came back and were like totally against these women flying and taking their jobs, or so they thought, but when people actually enjoyed having the women in service. Yeah, are there any questions?
Do you know anyone who is in like the ATA or WASP, or are you look for people to interview potentially? Because they would, unlike Emily's problem, I think they would still be alive.
They mostly aren't, but there are a lot of not a lot, but I found like 1 or 2 documentaries that have women speaking, and there are so many memoirs from the women, so I get their voices, and they interviewed each other in the late 80s, so I can get clips of those and oral histories. So I can't actually talk to them, but the resources are there. All right, I'll switch to Adams. And
thank you for.
Oh. Okay, Adam's tentative title is The Massacre of Jerusalem, The Most Certain Uncertainty. And just background, the Massacre of Jerusalem is kind of the end of the First Crusade, when the Crusaders finally broke into Jerusalem, and there was a whole bunch of chaos for a few days, or he said it's uncertain how long it kind of was. So he's studying the Massacre at Jerusalem in 1099 AD, which is one of the best recorded events of the Middle Ages. But the problem is with the details. They differ among various sources, and over the years historians have incorporated their own judgments, so that kind of leaves a mess. So he kind of wants to wade through this because they focus on the specifics of the carnage and kind of combining the most horrifying aspects, and he wants to see if they're really presenting an accurate picture, if all details should be taken into account instead of just these like terrible portions, and if they should be more critical and discerning of the details they choose to incorporate. And he wants to look at what Islamic and Byzantine accounts add, because most of these are European. So historiography features greatly within this. That's mostly what he's looking at. So the project is inspired by historian Benjamin Kidar's article, The Jerusalem Massacre of July 1099 in the Western Historiography of the Crusades. And it kind of goes over how and why disagreements arose about the massacre over the centuries, but it's a European perspective. And the second European perspective he looked at is Jonathan Riley Smith's The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading. And it kind of showed an empathetic portrayal of the Crusaders, which was controversial. It focuses on experiences rather than the events. And then Riley Smith's second work on the First Crusade, which is called The First Crusades, focuses again on Europeans and looks at crusading families as dominant players. Finally, he found a book about Islamic perspectives. The problem is that this historian is not a Crusader historian, so she has a lot of shortcomings, but she does call for a reevaluation of the Crusades from an Islamic perspective, so it brought up a lot of questions. And then Jonathan Harris's Byzantium and the Crusades, which really focuses on the Fourth Crusade rather than the First, but it does provide a perspective from the Byzantine Empire. So in summary, there was like 2 European sources, 1 Islamic that isn't that great, and then 1 of Byzantine, which is on the wrong period. So he's kind of looking for a synthesis of the 3 historical traditions to try and bring them all together to find out what exactly happened. And to do this, instead of covering the whole Crusades, he's going to focus on the massacre at Jerusalem and see why they failed to integrate the narratives. So the problem is that so many years have been spent on the Europeans, because you have European writers writing about the Crusades. Of course they're going to focus on the Europeans because it's like their ancestors. And then with the Islamic world and Byzantine Empire, historians have been focusing on like the entire empire instead of just the Crusades. So you kind of need all 3 for an accurate portrayal, or which is what he's saying. And to show this, he's doing it through the Massacre of Jerusalem in July 1099. And he's going to, the sources have been around for centuries, obviously. So he's going to go back over them and read sources from all 3, Byzantine, Islamic, and European, and kind of reinterpret and reconstruct a narrative of what happened in July 1099. And to organize his thesis, he's going to have 3 or 4 chapters: Western historiography, Islamic historiography, Byzantine and Greek historiography. And if there's not enough with the Byzantines, he's going to incorporate that with the Westerns under the heading of Christian historiography. And then finally, a new integrated narrative, which is him kind of cutting and pasting things together to produce a truly accurate narrative, which has not been done before. And yeah, that's about it.
It's a very, very good summary of what I was planning to do. In fact, again, this project keeps on changing on me because I keep on thinking of new things, and I talk it over with my mentor, and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea, and it's not necessarily different. This started out as motivations of the Crusaders, and then moved on to Massacre of Jerusalem and what has been said, what details, and now I'm still very much. It's still very much going to be the Massacre of Jerusalem is definitely going to be a focus, but it's switching to more of looking at the relationship between trauma and narrative, where understanding how the historiography has portrayed this is very much important. It's going to be looking at how the experience of a crusade leads to either A, these actions happening, this horrific massacre, or B, why are they recording it as such. And in order to get a better understanding, I'm actually going to, Jonathan Harris becomes immensely more important now, because I'm going to be looking at the Fourth Crusade. Not the entirety of the Fourth Crusade, more of the sack of Constantinople, because whereas the Massacre of Jerusalem is seen as the success of the First Crusade, the sack of Constantinople in 1204 is seen as the failure of the Fourth Crusade. And the narratives, as far as I understand, are quite different. The First Crusade is like they're overcome by fervor, so they go around killing a bunch of people, also searching for plunder, and whereas Constantinople is very much, there were a bunch of greedy Europeans that wanted to take over the empire, and it's left at that. The narrative itself isn't really looked at in terms of the descriptions or comparing it to Jerusalem, which I want to show is like, is this a unique occurrence? Is Jerusalem a unique occurrence, or is there something about the experience of the crusade that leads to this sort of thing? So are there any questions? I know it keeps on changing on me. So, yeah.
Are you going to look at any sort of like quest for relics, or is that not going to figure, like looking for the shards of the cross or the Holy Grail Ark of the Covenant, or is that not really faded?
Not really. I mean, it could. Again, it's very much in its infancy now. It's possible because part of the First Crusade was the discovery of the Holy Lands. And, that led to massive consequences after that. So it's a possibility. Yeah.
Are you working in foreign sources, like foreign languages, or is it all translated?
A lot of them are translated, but ideally I'd like to see the original. A number of Crusader documents are in Latin, which I need to get at least a base understanding of. There's no way I'm going to be able to work with Islamic sources, though, in the near future.
So where do you think your travels are going to take you to find these sources?
London, probably, if I can get there. That's the thing. It's like, if I can get some money to help fund this, possibly, because the Institute of Historical Research has Crusader documents, so see what they have.
Are we working with anything other than written records? Like, for instance, archaeological? Because I know you were talking about, like, the Siege of Jerusalem, and there's that one famous quote where, like, they're wading through blood, and it's like, well, in order to get that much blood, there have to be, like, hundreds and whatever of, like, bodies, and that would leave a very, an archaeological record, because their skeletons would be somewhere. So, like...
Not really. Well, because in fact they're removed and burned and all that. So, and Jerusalem has been, doing any sort of excavation in Jerusalem, I believe, is impossible at this point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.